So welcome to Pentucket Visioning Session number 1. Thank you all for coming. My name is Brad Dorr. I see some familiar faces in the audience. I am a West Newbury resident. I've had 4 kids either go through the system or are now in the system as a junior and a senior. I'm also fortunate to be the principal of Dorr & Woody Architects, and we were fortunate to be able to get the commission to be the designer for the proposed new school building project. So we're excited to be here. I have with me as part of my team, Jason Boone, who will be leading the visioning session tonight, who's an educational planner within our firm. Emily Ray, also an educational planner within the firm. And John Richardson, who is the project manager for this project. We also have over here, stage right, John Lemieux, okay, and Steve Theron, both with Vertex, who are the owner's project managers, integral to the overall process. And what we're going to do tonight really is establish the foundation for what we want to do, okay, in the future in terms of the educational delivery here as part of the district. And this is really fundamental for us when you think of architects and designers, you know, they go and do buildings, but what we really need to do is we really need to understand how this building is intended to function. And what do people want to get out of this building over the next 50 years? And how do we want to deliver education as part of Pentucket's plan for the next 50 years? So with that, I will turn it over to Jason, and he's going to lead you through this process. This process is going to be very interactive. We're going to have several breaks where we're going to be asking questions and for you to be able to respond, and Jason's going to go through all of that. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. I'll share a few more details about my professional background as part of the evening's events. But for now, let's take care of a couple of housekeeping things first. By way of the format, Brad mentioned this is going to be interactive. There are going to be some presentations also along the way, but at any time you should feel free to get up and use the facilities if you need to. For those of you who don't know where they are, they're just down the hall. You got to make a decision at the fire extinguisher. If you're looking for the men's room, go to the right. If you're looking for the women's room, just continue straight down the hall. We will have food about halfway through, around 6 o'clock. We'll make sure that gets all set up during our activity right before that dinner break. Right now, our plan is to not have any activity during dinner break to give you a little mental relief from the 4-hour session that we have tonight. We also have moments in the evening's activities where it's a formal sort of pause to give you a chance to digest whatever we just talked about and ask questions. But we want this to be, as Brad said, interactive. And if at any moment along the way a really pressing question comes up, please don't hesitate to interrupt us and ask that question. Okay, here's the agenda for the evening. We're going to start off by trying to give everybody sort of a global understanding of why we're here. We're going to talk about the MSBA process. That's the Massachusetts School Building Authority. They're the financial partner in a project like this. Part of the funding for these kinds of projects comes from the state sales tax, and they have a very prescriptive process that we have to follow, so we want to walk you through that this evening. Then we're going to jump right into our very first exercise as sort of a primer for, as Brad said, talking about education and the future and how that plays out here in Pentucket Regional School District. Then we're going to do 2 presentations on education intended to talk about sort of how the world has changed since this building was built, since the middle school was built, and how education has changed. I think you'll hear a lot of pundits out there say that education is the same as it was 100 years ago. I'm not one of those people that believes that. I think it has actually changed a lot. What hasn't evolved as quickly is the facilities where education is happening. So we want to talk about that a little bit. After the education piece, we're going to have a really important exercise where we're going to ask you to provide some input on what the project goals and objectives should be. What's going to define for you as an individual, as a citizen, as a parent, a successful project. And we'll have you record your conversations at your small tables on the flip charts in front of you. Then we'll have dinner. And then we're going to go through, you see maybe when you came in, all of these boards on the back wall. We're going to try to give you some context for what a 21st century educational facility can look like. And then we're going to ask you at the end to identify things that maybe you're drawn to, that maybe are a little scary, that you would like to know more information about. By no means are we asking anybody to make any final decisions tonight, right? We have 2 years, right, before, we have 3 years, at least 3 years before we walk into, any final realized project. So we're just getting the process started tonight. Any questions about the agenda and sort of what we're going to do this evening? Silence is affirmation, so just be cognizant of that. So in terms of big picture decisions, if you boil everything down, there's really only 3 decisions that have to be made. The first big decision is, what kind of project are we going to pursue? Is it a high school only project, or is it a combination middle school, high school project? The MSBA has agreed to 2 different design enrollments, and we'll face that issue directly at visioning session number 2 next week. How is the building organized? And there are lots of different ways that you can organize a building. You can organize it by department, you can organize it by public-private, you can organize it by grade level teams. We want to have that kind of discussion. And that will also actually happen in visioning session number 2. And then finally, the MSBA requires that you explore multiple construction approaches. Is it a renovation only? Is it a renovation addition? Or is it a new construction? In order to provide due diligence, we have to explore all 3 of those construction types for both the high school only and the middle high school scenarios. So over the next year or so, right, these 3 decisions will have to be made. And this group, this visioning group, is going to be one of the entities that's going to provide input into those 3 big project decisions. We'll also be reaching out to the general public as sort of community forums to also provide input for those key decisions. Here's the overall MSBA process. It's organized into 8 fundamental steps, some of which you've already completed. That acronym SOI stands for Statement of Interest. You submitted that back in the spring of 2015. The MSBA said, yep, we're willing to participate with you. You hired Vertex as the OPM and us as the designer, and then here we are. We are just starting the feasibility study process. You can't quite read those numbers, but that says Module 3 right there in that green circle. Over the next year, we're going to complete the feasibility study and schematic design process, and that's where our focus will be in Modules 3 and 4, where we'll do these basic tasks. We'll define how the education is going to work. We're going to define what spaces will be in the project. We're going to explore a wide range of options. We're going to provide multiple cost estimates over the next year. The public and the school building committee will get to narrow the many options down to the few and ultimately select the preferred option right before we move into schematic design. And then at the conclusion of schematic design, everyone gets to vote in the town to authorize funding to set the project budget. So the next year, right, those big decisions we just talked about will conclude with setting the project budget at the conclusion of schematic design. Here's just a little more detail about modules 3 and 4. Here we are right here, starting our first public visioning session. We've already had our consultants in the building doing existing conditions analysis to tell us what conditions the architectural systems are in. I mentioned that we're going to develop a full range of options near the end of Module 3, and ultimately we'll select a preferred option next summer. As we progress into schematic design, we'll develop that design even further, refine cost estimates, and then just as I mentioned, right now, assuming all things go according to plan, the town will be voting to either authorize or not funding in the fall of next year. So what are we doing as part of the programming process? You guys are that top bullet, right? We're going to engage you first. We're also going to prepare a set of space needs analysis. As I mentioned, the MSBA has a series of procedural steps that we have to follow They also have spatial guidelines that these projects have to follow. So this first space needs analysis will be comparing what you've got today with the MSBA guidelines. Are classrooms too small? Are there too few of them? Is the auditorium too small? Is the gym too small or too big? Is the cafeteria, right? And so we'll present that analysis as part of this programming process. We will also be drilling down into the details with other folks, right? We've already started to engage the principals. We will engage end users, classroom teachers, students, chairpersons. Once we get into, okay, what happens in this specific room? So there's a wide variety of people that we're going to be talking to in order to define the project, but it starts right here with you folks in this room. Ultimately, all of that information will go to the working group, which is a subset of administrators, school building committee people, school committee people, to synthesize all of this input first, and then they'll make recommendations along the way to both the school building committee and the school committee. Those bullets in bold are our objectives for tonight. We want to give people an understanding of how education has changed. We want to explore how a new or renovated project could support education. And then the big one is probably the third one up there. We want to give you an opportunity to define what a successful project, its goals and objectives might look like. In our subsequent 2 visioning sessions, as I mentioned, right, we're going to explore the design enrollment, the school building organization, and then in visioning session number 3 in December, we're actually going to do some conceptual design work with all of you folks, where we asked you, what does the music conservatory as a concept look and feel like? How should it be organized? How should, if we express innovation schools, what should they look like? So we're going to be doing some design work. We're actually going to ask you to draw in visioning session number 3. We'll bring some of our folks too, right, if we need somebody else to be the pen. I'm zipping through these. These are just more details about each of the 3 visioning sessions. So let's pause there. What questions do you have about the process? Who's going to be involved? What are we trying to accomplish? When is it going to happen? Don't ask me how much it's going to cost, because I don't know. Nothing? Yes, sir. Don.
One of the rumors that's been going around is whether or not 6th grade would move up into the junior high.
That's a good question. It's not an impossibility, but my understanding, and others chime in if you know better, the MSBA and the district have only agreed to these 2 design enrollments that I mentioned, the 7 through 12 scenario and the 9 through 12 scenario. So it would take a communication back to the MSBA saying, hey, we've thought about this some more. Would you consider allowing us to bring 6th grade up? And those conversations can go, any number of ways. But at the moment, 6th grade is not part of the project.
Where is the site location? Is it behind?
You mean, where are we going to put this project? The short answer is we don't know. I think the only thing that there's consensus around is that it's going to be on this piece of property somewhere. We've talked a little bit about exploring alternative sites in all 3 towns, and I think the general consensus is there aren't any good options. Right? We often do have to explore other sites as part of the process, but in this case, I think it's pretty clear that it's going to go on this piece of property somewhere. And because we have to explore those 3 construction options, it may go partly right where the building is, and in addition, off to one side or the other. It may go in front, it may go in back. We may explore, over there on the middle school side, but we understand that there are a lot of site restrictions on this piece of property, so that will unfold as we move through the process a little more. What Brad is saying is, if the district chose to explore a site that they didn't already own in one of the other towns, that the cost to purchase that property is not reimbursable by the MSBA. So that additional cost would be fully borne by the 3 towns. Other questions about process? Okay. So I promised that I would tell you a little bit more about myself, and I'll do that as a way of framing this warm-up exercise. I come to this work from two different lenses. This is the first one. That's me. 20 years and how many pounds ago. I was a high school math teacher in suburban Indianapolis. And this was my classroom. I was seeing between 25 and 30 kids, 7 of 8 periods a day, every day. I had 32 of these tablet armchairs in my classroom, and not everybody wanted to be there. And this was my classroom too. My classroom management skills got better as I got a little more experienced. This was AP calculus. Pre-calculus. And this was my classroom. So I come to this work from the lens of being a classroom teacher, being frustrated by the space that I was in, trying to do things to serve my students that my room wasn't really capable of doing. And for those of you that are teachers, you may have experienced some of those same things in your buildings. This is the other lens I come to this work through. This is my son Parker, he's 3. This is my daughter, she's 7 weeks. I was in charge of haircut that day. I think about the future a lot with these two guys, right? Parker's gonna graduate from high school in 2032. I have no idea what the world's gonna look like in 2032. I have no idea what he's gonna do for work. I have no idea what political or social or environmental conditions are gonna look like 30 years from now. But that's part of the challenge we're all faced with. We're gonna be designing and building something that's gonna survive even well past these two guys' graduation date. So I come to this work as a teacher and a father. And I know that you all bring your own lenses to bear, and we want to use those things to enrich the conversation. Around 118 years ago, actually, some others did the same sort of thinking about the future. This was a postcard that was developed just ahead of the 1900 World's Fair. Some artists were asked to speculate about what the world would look like in the year 2000. So this was their image of what farming might look like. Housekeeping. And they pretty much got it not too bad, right? We have mechanized farming, we have the Roomba, right? But this was their idea of education. Tell me what's happening here. What do you notice about this image of learning? Passive, and how so?
The kids are just, they're not doing anything, they're just being fed the
Okay, the teacher is in control of the information, putting it in a machine, right? It's being fed directly to them. Yes, Emily? They're all boys. What does that say? What else? Oh, come on. Earbuds, headphones, yep. It's the same experience for everyone, right? Except this poor kid, right? So it's important that we think about what the educational experience is, because it may not be the same for all of us. But if we do our job correctly, how we think about learning, how we think about education should shape how we think about a building. How about this image of education? What does this say? They're all girls, right? What else? Okay, they're working together, actively engaged. They are sewing. Can anybody guess what course is being taught here? Nope. Social studies. These kids were preparing puppets to put on a play about the conditions for women in the Middle East as part of their social studies curriculum. And it's from High Tech High, which is out a franchise out in California. So, right, this kind of image communicates very different ideas about what education, what learning could be. And if you notice, the space could be very different even than what they have. So with those couple of primers in your small groups, you don't have to record this activity, but we want you to take 5 or 6 minutes and talk amongst yourselves and respond to these 2 prompts. Can everybody read that? How is the world different from when you were in school? How is it the same? How should your child's learning experience differ from your learning experience? How should it be the same? So at your small groups, at your tables, just talk about those 2 prompts. Okay, let's just have some volunteer groups report out. First to the first prompt. Who wants to tell us about how the world has changed and how it's the same? Anybody? It's going to be just like my classroom, isn't it? Yes.
We talked about how one of the big changes is that home life is different, and so that's a big change. Communication, the way people communicate, the way kids communicate. Technology is everywhere, but it's not necessarily being vetted the way you might wish for kids. We feel like in days gone by, one size fit all more, and discipline was a little bit different when we were younger.
So let's probe that for just a minute. 2 things. Let's do the discipline one first. Yes, it's changed, but how and in which direction?
So who said discipline?
Marcia and I.
Okay.
Discipline, back in the day, you either complied, and if you didn't comply, then you went to the principal's office. And from what I remember, the principal was supported by the parents, where now we have to look at the whole picture. Not we have to, but we should be looking at the whole picture. And it's not about complying as much as sometimes a student isn't complying because they're bored, they're not being challenged, or maybe the information is going over their head, and then now they're indifferent. And so the reasons that they're not complying are a little bit different. It's not always just because they don't want to do well. Generally, we find kids want to do well.
And let me see if I can paraphrase, in the old days, it used to not matter what the reason for the disciplinary problem was. Now we're much more sensitive to the underlying causes, and we try to correct whatever those underlying causes are, rather than just simply say, hey, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, get in line. Or okay, good. How about another group? Students, terrific.
Hello. In our group, we talked a lot about the prevalence of technology in the classroom. Like, obviously, I'm still in high school, so I didn't really know what it was like back then. But Dr. Mulqueen and Mr. Seymour talked about like how non-prevalent compared to today's technology was in the classroom. And then today, I know me and Lindsay were talking about like how using a laptop or a phone as for an activity in a classroom is like a very normal occurrence, and it definitely helps the classroom. And then we also talked about like how having textbooks online would be so much easier than having to like have the actual physical textbook. I can say from experience that it's definitely a plus side to that.
Technology is certainly a huge shift, and we'll talk about that a little more in a minute. My phone went head was like a dial. All right, how about the second prompt? Who wants to tell us about your child's learning experience?
We talked about how, as students, we had to learn how to find information. We had to get to the library. We had to know how to use the Dewey Decimal System. We had to know what an encyclopedia was, that you had to start with the index and work backwards. But we find that there's so much information now immediately available to them that the learning should maybe be about how to vet that information or how to separate fake news from real news.
This is a really important topic, actually. When I went to school, information was contained in a very few places, either in the mind of an adult expert or in the library. And if it came from one of those two sources, you basically just trusted that it was okay. now, as you say, there's so much information out there. The important skill is being able to identify the validity of whatever that information is before you accept it as fact and useful. What else? Learning experiences.
So we talked a little bit about the collaborative aspect as opposed to that sort of stand and deliver model where the teacher was the expert and the students were an empty vessel and they would deposit that knowledge. And now learning is and needs to be more collaborative and more around problem solving and application of skills. That's the way students, work together and will need to work together for the job market, at least how it's changing now. So that's a different model of instructional delivery as well as learning.
And so you can all go home. That's what the whole point of this evening is. What else? Did you have something to share, Julie or Aaron?
So to piggyback to that, we talked a lot about how classrooms are designed differently than they used to be, and we see a big push if you look online and kind of see like the High Tech High and those kind of places, the flexible classroom walls moving maybe, or maybe just alternative seating options, lots of more table work rather than individual desk work, which you would see in a stand and deliver classroom.
So one of the biggest things that I see is exactly what you're talking about. Learning is happening in a much wider variety of environments, even within the school building, than it did when I was a teacher, right? I was asked, in fact, to stay within the confines of my room every time I tried to go out and have the kids measure the baseball diamond as a part of my geometry class, or to drop, God forbid, eggs off the back of the football bleachers. That was frowned upon. So we're going to talk about that, the different kinds of learning environments that we might see, more flexible learning environments. So the experts have responses to these questions also, and we'll quickly go through. These aren't, my thoughts about how the world in education has changed, but these are some outside experts. So Carl Fish created a presentation for his students one year entitled Shift Happens. It was about all the ways the world has changed sort of over the last decade, and it's now become a phenomenon. But his basic message was this: that the mission of education today is to prepare kids for an unknown future. And that's an enormous challenge. Things are changing so fast that we have no idea, like my children, what they're going to be doing for work, what problems the world's going to have, what challenges they're going to face. And so how in the world do we do that? These are some of the top in-demand jobs in the last decade, none of which existed before the year 2007. And a lot of the experts believe that many of these in-demand jobs will be out of demand very quickly. Until I started doing this kind of work, I didn't even know what a user experience designer was. Does anybody know what a user experience designer does? That's exactly right. Right? The sort of emotional reaction to what you're seeing on the screen. How easy is it to use? Am I willing to not just be a browser, but be a buyer, and all the science that goes along with designing that sort of thing? This is a chart that was published by the New York Times a couple of years ago, and I think it's really important because it communicates how technology is impacting all of our lives, and especially our pocketbooks. And I know I personally have felt this. I'm sure some of you have also. This top line represents the growth in the per capita GDP in the United States since 1993. The bottom line represents the median household income over that same time frame. And for years and years and years and years, these two lines sort of marched along together. But then something happened in around 1997. And the economist that likes to talk about this graph points to one specific event. Can anybody think about what that might be? 1997. The internet was already around, not a bad guess. She graduated from high school, and everything just went from there. IBM's Deep Blue beat Gary Kasparov at chess for the first time. It was the first time that a machine had the cognitive ability that exceeded that of a human being, at least on a very specific task. Did he guess that? And so while there are a lot of other things going on, it's a representation of how technology is impacting people's daily lives, particularly in the workforce. Right? We've long known that technology has allowed for assembly lines, right, to be automated. Right? We all go to the grocery store now, and there are fewer checkout tellers because we can do it ourselves with a machine. We don't have toll booth collectors anymore in Massachusetts because it can be automated now. And that's only going to continue. And so the next development of this, for those of you who have been following it, is likely to be artificial intelligence. And so we all sort of know that our human physical strength isn't really valued in the workplace anymore. What you're seeing on the screen is a set of data on the left and a completely new prose report written on the right without the intervention of a human being. Wordsmith, this is a corporation, specializes in natural language generation. Right, so a machine has written those paragraphs, that report on the right, without a person. So we're very quickly approaching the place where our cognitive abilities may not be as valued in the workplace either. And so what does that mean in terms of jobs and what skills are important to learn as students? This is a company, World Economic Forum, who speculates about the future. They have data from businesses all over the world that reported in 2015 that these were the top skills companies were looking for. And they've speculated about what those skills would be in 2020. And so I just want to note that in terms of priority, creativity was already on the list in 2015, but they're projecting that it jumps to number 3 in 2020. And so how do we deal with that, in American high schools? How has education changed? We think at Dorr and Whittier of the educational experience of young people being a three-legged stool, right? There's what children learn, there's how they learn, and then there's where they learn. And obviously we specialize in that third one, in the facility itself. But the other legs have changed as well. So we'll quickly go through these. When I was a teacher, this was the basic curriculum, right? The 4 R's, right? The conventional content. That was certainly true when this building was built in the mid-1950s. Over the years, we've added more content to the curriculum, right? And this word "and" is going to be a common theme as you see moving forward. Technology became much more prevalent, so we had a course on computers. Right? We realized that some children weren't going to take the college-bound path, so we added some vocational training along the way. And then in 1990s, the law changed, and we started specifically dealing with students with disabilities, right? And that's really changed, the use of space in our schools. And then even since then, places like Pentucket do a really good job of augmenting all of those things with even more conventional content. My favorite one is this. That's the name of a course that's offered here at the high school. It's about technology and how it's impacted the world, right? Also, character sculpture. They didn't have that when I went to school. So, right, there's more and more demands on teachers, on space, on school districts, just from a conventional content point of view. And in the technical disciplines, a lot of the experts are saying that the specifics become obsolete in as few as 2 years. So when you think about this in terms of a college graduate, when my son starts as a freshman, whatever he learns, if it's in a technical discipline, is going to be completely irrelevant by the time he graduates. So how do you deal with that reality? And so one of the shifts we see in education, I think some of you have mentioned this, right? Emily stole my thunder. It's not just about conventional content. It's also about other kinds of abilities, right? It's being able to think critically. It's being able to collaborate with your peers. Brad will tell you that this is his entire job description, right? That it's about being able to work with people, being able to communicate. This is something that the sandbox that I play in. And then all of our people at Dore & Whittier, right? That creativity toolbox. How do we teach creativity as a skill set? Those are the direction, as you saw in that table that had the 2015 skills and the 2020 skills. It's not just about that conventional content. And in addition to that, we're focusing more and more on social emotional learning. You talked about discipline before, Marcia. We used to take this kind of learning for granted. This is the thing that happened on the playground or on the school bus or on the sports field, right? We've come to realize that as those devices in children's pockets become, more and more distracting, that this social emotional skill set is really important to cover in an intentional way, not an accidental way. The idea of being self-aware, right? Of having relationship skills so that you can get along with your peers. A really important part of the curriculum. And so to sort of summarize that a little bit, when this building was built, it was more about memorization of facts and figures, right? Getting the students to retain as much of that data as possible. It's now more about demonstrating what your abilities are, right? Or learning how to learn. It's going to become more and more important the faster information changes. We talked about it used to be about one-size-fits-all approach to curriculum. Pentucket's already doing a really good job of providing students with lots and lots of individual student choices as it relates to the curriculum. It's no longer about these sort of isolated boxcars, right? There's a math boxcar and a social studies boxcar, and then there was a computer boxcar, right? We're recognizing that to solve these really big problems, all of those disciplines have to be interconnected. And right, again, this is also about space for us. So how do you position space to make that connection? And then finally, we're realizing more and more that simulating the real world is not the best way to serve students. If we can provide them with authentic experiences, and I got an example of this in a few minutes, where students are doing the real work of scientists or computer programmers or construction people, right? That's a much better learning experience than simulating it on the computer in the high school classroom. And if we can provide those experiences, all the better. So like I said, Pentucket is already, as a district, embracing many of these shifts in education. This is a diagram that depicts what the regional curriculum is across all grade levels. This is sort of that conventional content column. But then those other skills fall into these other two triangles. They label them personal meaning and adaptive leadership, and you can sort of read underneath what those things entail. Just like we talked about collaboration, strategic thinking, independence. Teaching those things intentionally rather than accidentally. And then in terms of student choice, they're also doing that by organizing some of the course offerings by these 6, what are being called innovation academies. This is the idea that students will be engaged in learning more if they have choice about what courses they take, and they can take much deeper dives into certain content that they're interested in and less deep dives in other content. And so those things are organized by these 6 innovation academies. So we'll just take a quick pause here again. And this time I want you to record the results on your flip chart of your small group conversation. There are 3 prompts here, and I'll tell you a quick story before we turn you loose on this. I actually tested this activity with our staff a few weeks ago, and the feedback I got that it was very difficult for them to project, even in their own lives, the things that they learned in high school, the skill sets that they're using in their current lives that have value. And so we first want you to think about that conventional content, right? What are you using in your personal adult lives that's the most valuable? Then those other skills, creativity or collaboration, sort of softer characteristics, which ones of those are the most valuable? And finally, what should we be looking for students to possess at Pentucket High School? And I'll share with you my responses to this. In the design capacity, I use my algebra and geometry skills almost every day. As someone who's designing spaces related to education and someone who has a toddler at home, child psychology is a very important part of my life. Obviously learning theory, I do an awful lot of writing, and obviously we do an awful lot of graphic design as part of the work we do. But then in terms of the softer skills, this last one is one that I see a lot of teenagers having difficulty with, given that they're spending a lot of time on screens. And it's something that I certainly use almost every day in my professional life. So with that context, why don't you take about 10 minutes and see, as small groups, you can respond to these 3 prompts.
So, like, what conventional content do you all use? I bet we share.
Like in our like outer school lives, like I'd say interpersonal skills and like not necessarily public speaking, but like personal skills and like learning to work as a group are like very prevalent in my life because Mr. Schumacher, the jazz director, he like has us like book gigs and stuff for ourselves, and like we have to like talk with like the people who like want to hire us and like money goes to school, but like negotiate over money and stuff like that, and like that's I can see myself using that throughout my entire life.
How about writing?
Yes.
I write a lot.
I think like even like typing. I think.
John, do you want to write this because you kind of this way?
Oh sure. Yeah.
So John was saying that
That's it, yeah, I'd agree with writing. I do a tremendous amount of writing. Usually that's
Psychology,
sometimes. Sometimes.
I mean, I'll even say stuff like stuff that I learned in PE. I mean, I haven't, how I do stuff in the yard, move around in my daily life, understanding of my physical self, I think since high school.
But it was basic, like how to save a document.
It's $25 to take my picture.
And to reproduce it. Typing, child development, writing, problem solving, computer skills. Want to move on to 2?
let's go to 2.
Let's go to 2.
And computer skills could be used again for that.
Okay, it looks like everybody is on prompt number 3. Quickly finish up. What I'd like you to do is take your flip charts and hang them on those 4 columns over there. Try to get everybody's work on those 4 columns. And then we want you to get up from your tables and go review everybody else's work. And then I'm going to ask you to report out on what the commonalities are. Okay, so post your work on those 4 columns and then read your neighbor's work. So while you're standing, somebody tell me what commonalities you see. What's emerging as on everybody's sheets? Anything?
A lot of typing.
Typing. That's interesting. In what capacity? Is a skill that people use every day, or in a skill?
For me, it was a typewriter with a record and a bell, and you were trying to get 50 words.
Yep.
And it was a royal, it was an electric royal.
Yeah. So that was a skill that's important in your everyday life.
Yeah, if I was younger, I'd probably be talking about my laptop.
Okay.
Skills in terms of typing.
The students in the room, where are you? There you are. Do you think typing is a skill that's going to be important to you in the near future? Okay. What's interesting is that there's so much voice-to-text capability now right? In fact, just a few years ago, an ear piece was released at the Consumer Electronics Show that will actually translate foreign languages in real time, right? And so that kind of, technology to translate speech into, either spoken or written text is developing rapidly. What other commonalities did you see? Yes, Lindsay.
Collaboration was very prevalent, is very prevalent for most jobs.
Okay.
In terms of being able to give your ideas and adapt to other ideas as well.
And did most people have that on their list of things that was important for Pentucket students? Okay, what else? Communication, okay, in sort of all of its variety, right? Oral, written, graphic. Yes, John?
We also saw like just a lot of variations on like adaptability, adaptive learning, like critical thinking.
The ability to learn, right? To change course, right? We heard about being flexible in a wide variety of in social interactions. Good. Yes.
Embracing diversity.
Embracing. Tell me some more about that. What do you mean by that?
So I work at Raytheon, and you get a lot of old guys working with young people, working with people in different countries, speaking different accents, being able to embrace everyone's ideas and have a very inclusive environment when you're doing engineering.
Yep, and right, it's sometimes the nature of being a human being is we tend to prejudge, and it's hard to be effective if you don't, as you say, embrace the diversity of others. Okay, what else? Yes.
We had something that kind of went along with that, which was around perspective taking and being able to take a bigger world view than just your small community or communities.
Yep.
Be able to understand how other people might think and how things might shift if you were not just small.
There's a statistic, and I think it's that this year's high school graduates will change careers 18 times by the time they're 34. Change jobs. Yeah, sorry. Thank you for that clarification. But it's a testament to being able to change and change rapidly. What else?
Communication skills.
Yep, somebody said that, communication skills.
I think it's also going to be thought of going forward, right? How we communicate today is a lot different than how our kids communicate, and how when they get to high school is going to change because technology advances so rapidly.
Okay.
We have to think about that, not just teach them how to talk to each other.
So would an example of that being that you and I never had to think about communicating in social media in our teenage lives, in our early professional careers, but that's an everyday occurrence for folks now.
Think about workers today are much more remote than they ever have been. So you don't actually talk necessarily with your coworkers, but you need to know how to communicate with them. And these kids need to learn how that.
Okay, great. So what's interesting is much of the discussion, much of the commonality that's been mentioned weren't the conventional content things. And that's not to say that the conventional content isn't important, it is. But everybody has been drawn to those other things because they're as I mentioned, they're likely to be the ones that are rising to the top in terms of their importance, because the conventional content is just going to continue to change faster and faster and faster and faster. Yes.
To me, one of the most important things about being where you are when you get to be a grown-up is having a common base of literacy, that everybody has read the same things, that everybody has learned the same things, so that when someone makes a literary reference, you know what they're speaking of, or when someone speaks, they speak correctly, or when they send a letter, they know how to punctuate it properly. So I don't think you can discount traditional basic English literacy and math literacy, and we talked about that quite a lot in our.
Yep, and I think you're absolutely right. Those things will continue to be very important. And as we've mentioned earlier, sort of the theme of the evening is and, not we have to do this or do that. And so those basic kinds of literacies will continue to be very important for the distant future as well. All right, so let's return back to our seats. So I think the basic message from the curricular point of view is that many of the things that students were expected to learn when this building was built are still really important. And any new or renovated project has to be able to accommodate that, that kind of content. But in addition to that, it's very clear that there are other things that a new or renovated facility has to be able to accommodate as well from the curricular point of view. Let's quickly shift gears to how children are taught and how students learn. When this building was built, this was the common thinking, and we've talked about this a little bit already this evening, right? A building like this was designed so that, you know, every student basically had the same experience. And as the picture is showing, the same assessment technique. So we, you know, feel really bad for that fish, right? It's not his fault he can't climb a tree. There are lots of learning theories out there. I'll only mention these three prevalent ones. These are not new. But what I want to relay to you is that this building and the middle school were built at a time when behaviorism was the most dominant learning theory. This is B.F. Skinner. He was a cognitive psychologist. And basically, he theorized that learning was about an outside entity dispensing information to be absorbed by the student, right? It's the empty vessel model. And as you saw in my classroom, there's a time and a place for that. It's appropriate to provide direct instruction some of the time. But many of the schools of your vintage were designed to just count kids, divide that by 30. That's how many rooms you got. Make sure all the, you know, desks face the chalkboard, and that's what you get as a school. Even though constructivism and social constructivism are not new ideas, they're being much more widely embraced as a strategy for teaching and learning, and buildings are starting to reflect these learning theories in their designs. Jean Piaget said that he theorized that people construct knowledge based on their prior experiences. They explore the world for themselves. They don't need an outside entity to dispense information to them. Vygotsky said not only do you not need someone to dispense information to you, but it's a social interaction that's really important, right? We're a social species, we should learn in groups. And so when you think about those two learning theories in context of designing a building, it really changes how you think about space. You might provide more types of spaces, big spaces, little spaces, open spaces, closed spaces, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But these last two theories are being more widely embraced in the 21st century than they were when this building was constructed. Does anybody know who this is? It is Dr. Howard Gardner. He's a professor in the psychology department at Harvard. What's that? Well, he's from Harvard. He didn't publish his seminal work about multiple intelligences until 1983. Right, and for those of you that aren't familiar with this, this book, Frames of Mind, challenged the traditional definition of what intelligence was. Right, prior to this work, intelligence was thought of as those things that can be measured by an IQ test. Right, mostly logical, mathematical intelligences and linguistic intelligences. Through the work that he did, he theorized that there were as many as 8 different kinds of intelligences. And while he didn't intend for this to impact teaching and learning directly, once public education sort of embraced this notion, it started to change how teachers planned lessons. To give you an illustration of that, I taught geometry. So what I might do is give a lecture on the different types of triangles, and then as a way of testing how much of that information students retained, I would give them, a worksheet. Identify the types of triangles on this page. And that might engage the logical mathematical intelligence. It might engage the spatial intelligence, but it's not going to engage any of the others. So if I embrace this idea by Dr. Howard Gardner, I might do this instead, where I ask children to form each of these types of triangles with their own bodies, take pictures, make a presentation out of it, and therefore engage the interpersonal, intrapersonal, bodily, kinesthetic intelligences, right? And so again, it's a different way of using some research to change how we think about teaching and learning. This is a bit of research by the National Training Laboratory that communicates a similar message. This pyramid are rates of retention. And what it suggests is once you cross over a threshold from sort of passive learning strategies to active learning strategies, retention goes way up. And once you have to teach someone else about something, you really internalize that and retain it to the highest degree. It's evidence for more perhaps project-based learning approaches, or as I mentioned before, authentic learning experiences. Imagine talking about how turtles are impacted by debris on the beach. And you read about that in a textbook and you see some pictures of it on the screen, right? How much of that are you going to walk away with at the end of that course versus this, right? Where you're actually practicing what a professional scientist would do and you're doing it in the field, right? That would be at the bottom of that learning pyramid. Students are going to attain that a lot better than, perhaps staying in just the classroom. And this isn't a new idea, right? Maria Montessori made this observation about children at the end of the 19th century, right? It's just that facilities haven't been really designed to embrace this idea until recently. How many of you are familiar with the work of Ken and Rita Dunn? Ken and Rita Dunn studied the physical and motivational characteristics that impact teaching and learning. And basically what they said, what they found is when you provide students with conditions that match their preferences, student performance goes way up. And so it's not quite learning styles, but I use Emily and I as an example of this. She prefers to work in the dark. I prefer to work in a brightly lit room. Many of my coworkers prefer it noisy. I prefer it quiet. And so historically, we haven't provided these kinds of variations in the physical learning environment. But if we can, and we can allow students to choose the environment that works best for them, then there's evidence to suggest that student performance goes up. So again, to summarize, when this building was built, it was sort of one teaching strategy for all, mostly stand and deliver. Ideally, we would want to provide a physical environment that allows every student's learning experience to be tuned to their own personal needs. When this building was built, we largely learned alone. And based on our conversations that we just had, it would be terrific if we could provide an environment where children learned together. In my classroom, there was very little technology when I was teaching. And as the students said, now we would like to have ubiquitous access to technology. Your high school is not quite like this, but in the 20th century, most school buildings were organized so that students were anonymous. They didn't have any sort of sense of identity. And to some degree, your innovation academies allow students to associate with one or more of those academies as a sense of identity. And so what I'm going to show you is a short video on project-based learning and let some teachers describe how it's changed their students' lives. Maybe. Upside down backwards.
today's children function in a dangerous world? What means will they use to carve the future? Will they be equipped to find the answers to tomorrow's problems?
When you think about traditional learning, you think of a student sitting in a classroom and being talked at.
Now I imagine a lot of you are still thinking
They are supposed to be a sponge. The teacher tells them information and they suck it up. That's not the real world. Having them actively engaged, learning about things in their community and doing projects that they care about is giving them that ownership of their learning. It's making them lifelong learners. It's giving them the critical thinking and problem-solving skills that they need as soon as they walk out of your classroom into the real world.
So there are a lot of different ways to approach PBL, a lot of different ways to implement it, but really it all boils down to 5 essential keys. Real-world connection, core to learning, structured collaboration, student-driven, and multifaceted assessment. The first key component of PBL is real-world connections. And really what this entails is having an authentic problem that drives the curriculum. So students are given this question, for example, what's in our water and how did it get there? And then the students choose different paths to explore that question.
One of the problems in the ocean is that
One of the problems is that technology doesn't always work the way that you hope it will.
How will today's children function in a dangerous world? What means will they use to carve the future?
Let's skip that. So we'll try to get that working in the version that we post on the website. I apologize for the technical glitch. Basically what they were saying is that project-based learning is just one technique to do some of the things that we've talked about, gauge kids in real activities, to get them collaborating with one another, to get them to solve problems with unknown answers. And we're not advocating for that. We're just using that as example, again, of, 21st century school buildings need to be able to do more than just one thing. And perhaps project-based learning is one of those things among many that these schools need to accommodate. And so with that, what questions do you have about how education has changed? Oh, thank you.
Well, talking about multiple intelligences, when I went to school, there was college prep, and that's what I was in, so I don't know the other ones, but basically the kids who were going to not go to college and do trade schools or different things, they would be in it, fall into a different category, but a lot of those people have different intelligences that would be beneficial. So are kids divided these days still into a college prep, or is everyone mixed, and are there multiple intelligences brought out in group, like in a different way? I don't know how it is these days.
I can answer that, but perhaps someone from the district can answer this specifically for Pentucket. So it depends on the individual school district. In my experience, by and large, teachers today are trying to differentiate instruction for as many kids as they can, which means taking into account perhaps some of those multiple intelligence concepts. Some school districts choose to, I think what you're describing is leveling kids, where if they know that they can proceed at a faster pace, they're in an AP section, or they're in a college prep section, or they're in a regular section. I'm not sure if Pentucket is doing that or not. Other districts choose to have mixed groups, heterogeneous groups, and let students proceed at their own pace. So if they're capable of doing more, they're allowed to do more. In fact, I think I heard somebody tonight say every kid in their class has a different homework assignment. right? And so that does happen, and I think it depends on the district and the individual teacher to what degree those kinds of things are happening. Yeah.
Hello, Jeff Mulqueen, Superintendent. Thought I'd just jump in and help out a little bit. So it depends upon what you mean by your comment. It can be translated different ways. So one of the things that Pentucket's really involved in is accelerating everybody. So when you're ready, you get to go to the next step. So we have, for instance, early high school courses for credit at the middle school already. And we're trying to get that concept down into the elementary schools so that as soon as you're ready for something, we're able to accelerate you and get you, more tuned to what you're ready for rather than sticking with a cohort, with a group. And we're also trying to do that at the other end, using lots of technology for students who have maybe a learning disability who need some additional support to get to where they need to be, or students who are at, just every day, like you heard about the changes in the assignments. So it depends upon what you're defining as like grouping kids together, or we're trying to make it possible for every student to get exactly what they need on a personal level. In today's world, it's about kind of a designer mentality that keeps us going. So we want exactly what suits us, not really what suits the group. And that's kind of our approach to education too. So the closer we can get to providing individualized kinds of supports and more personalized kinds of trajectories and programming, the better we're going to be. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thank you, Dr. McQueen. We haven't heard from you yet. Why don't you go?
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the concept of how you could accommodate different desires for light, heat, whatever the environment. How do you do that in a school building?
After these messages, it's what's on the wall back here. So we'll actually talk about how these things can manifest themselves in a building design after we take our big break.
Just as a follow-up to the personalized education and just what you were talking about, what is the role do you see for brick and mortar buildings for schools, looking out into the future?
We could spend all night just talking about that question. What I can say, and this is you're asking me, so I'm going to give you my personal bent on that. I don't think that bricks and mortar schools are going to go away in our lifetimes. I do think that children will be out of that building more often than they have been historically, right? If we talk about authentic learning experiences, often those need to be provided outside the school, right? There are schools already that have no building at all. There's a high school in Columbus, Ohio called the Christopher Program, where there's no centralized place where students go. They take one course over in one building at the college, they take another course in a church basement, they take another course somewhere else. It's not virtual, but it's also not cohesive. It's technically a public charter school. Yep. So there's a lot of different flavors of what the facility looks like, but in my professional opinion, buildings themselves won't go away, in our lifetimes. Okay? Other questions? Yeah.
Bernice McCarthy came up with a format, and she narrowed it down to 4 pieces of pie, something that made a huge difference in the way I delivered to my students years ago. The first piece of the pie was students learn best through discussing, like exactly what we're doing. That's the highlight for them, and that's the 90%. The second piece is somewhat like my wife, who was great at taking notes and getting A's on all of her tests. 3 is I don't need to read about how to sail, just let me get out into the bay and let me fool around with that and figure it out myself. And the 4 is to use all of those 3 and find out how I can use those 3 in accomplishing whatever I need to today. It completely changed my my delivery in terms of my work with kids.
And who was the resource?
This was Bernice McCarthy. You can Google it. Format. She just did an outstanding job, and it all started one day when she had to go to school, and the vice principal said, "Your son is not motivated," and she said, "He was motivated when he left my house this morning. What happened?"
That's terrific. What other questions do you have about how education has changed? All right, so we're getting ready to take our dinner break, but before we do, we want to do this third exercise, and this is a really important one. Again, we want you to record this, and then at the conclusion of you writing things down, we want you to post them on the columns again over there. So you have some context now, right? You sort of know what process we're going to follow for this project. You know, we've talked a lot about how the world has changed and how education has changed, and perhaps what this building wants to try to be able to do educationally. But now we're going to ask you to think with that and much more broadly. How would you define a successful process? Right? These are things like engaging as many of us as you can, right? Allowing us to participate. It has a blah, blah, blah conclusion, right? Whatever your response is to that open-ended question. It's really important for us as a design team and for the working group and the school committee and the school building committee to know what's important to you. So what issues and values do you want us to know about? What are the most important ones to you? And then similarly, what things do you want to know more about? Or what things do you have concerns about? This is probably going to be the biggest financial commitment these three towns have made and may ever make, at least in our lifetimes. So what concerns or questions do you have? So again, let's take about 10 minutes, talk about this amongst your tables, and then post your results over there on the columns. What are we seeing up here? Let's talk about prompt number 1 first. What do we think a successful process is?
All three towns saying yes.
All three towns saying yes, right? That it results in being funded. Yep, okay. What else?
People feel their voices are heard.
That it's an inclusive process, right? Everybody has an opportunity to get involved in the decision-making and input process, okay? What else? That the process does that, or the process results in a building that does that, okay? How about, yeah, go ahead.
Transparency up here.
Okay. What does that mean?
Letting the community know like how the process is going.
Right. So it's not just about you, us receiving input from you. We have to provide information back out to the public all along the entirety of the process. What about prompt number 2? What's most important to you? What are you seeing up there on the wall? A quality project, whatever quality means. Okay. Flexibility. I suspect that this is a word we're going to hear a lot over the next year or so. What do you mean by flexibility? That the building is flexible? Okay. Well, there's lots of different types of flexibility, and we'll talk about that after dinner. What other things are important to you?
Community excitement and also them being able to use the building.
Community use of the building. Okay. That's going to get into visioning session number 2's discussion about where do we put different pieces and parts so that perhaps they can be accessible by the general public. What else? What other issues are important to you? Yes? Safety and security, paramount actually in the design of a new or renovated facility. Okay? Yes? Sustainability, energy efficiency, recyclable materials, other maintaining it. Okay, good. What other issues are important? Yes, Mr. Dorr.
I want it to look cool.
The aesthetic appearance of the building, all right? Okay, that the building itself enables creativity. Okay, great. Those are high objectives. Yes, Scott.
Resistance to technological obsolescence.
Resistance to technological obsolescence. That sort of falls in that flexibility category, but in a much finer scale. Okay? That's really hard to do, by the way, but we will embrace that. What else? Mr. Haddon. Longevity, durability. So this building has been in existence for 65 or so years, right? So this new project is probably going to survive at least that long, if not longer. Okay, what else?
How about a roof with at least a 512 pitch?
A roof.
Instead of a flat.
We can talk about that. How about the third prompt? What questions or concerns do you have?
Community buy-in.
Community.
Where the systems apply right here. There's a lot of people that say, why do we do high school? I did just fine. I'm successful. That's a big, huge.
So could everybody hear Ruth? She said community buy-in, right? A lot of our citizens, right, we're sort of preaching to the choir in this room. How do we convince our citizens that something new, perhaps even something different, is necessary? Well, part of the intent of these 3 visioning sessions is to invite as many people to the table as we can, but for those of you that are in the room to start to be our champions out to those other citizens who are not here tonight and start the process of explaining what we've gone through and why a new facility is needed. But certainly we will embrace that on the procedural side, and my first example of that is we're about to release our existing conditions findings. Right, I talked about the space needs analysis. Those are 2 pieces of evidence that will support the idea of a newer renovated facility. What else?
Someone brought up that was really good. Everybody was like, yeah, that's what I was thinking in the back of my head. Disruption during construction.
Okay, a concern, right? If we build a building on this piece of property, what's the experience of the kids that are in the building during that construction? Right, and how are we going to manage that? That's a completely valid concern. And we will pay attention to that. What other questions or concerns do you have? Yeah, John?
I think getting not necessarily people, but adequate funding and space for each different section of high school, like the arts, science, English.
Equity. Okay, great. Yes? What is the cost of doing nothing? That will be an important dollar figure to communicate to folks because there is a cost to not doing anything. That will be part of our existing conditions analysis. And what has happened in the past, right? Right, and I actually asked somebody to bring that question up. We said that a key objective of a successful process was to make sure it passed in all 3 towns, but what if it doesn't? What are the consequences? So there's sort of, there's a technical answer to that in terms of the MSBA process, and then there's perhaps a different answer based on how people perceive the school building itself. And so I heard some groups say that if we don't get a new or renovated facility, that the consequence is we're going to lose kids. They're going to go somewhere else. And that may be a reality. From the MSBA's point of view, if the funding doesn't pass, the project ends. Right, you can always resubmit a statement of interest, but you would essentially have to start the process all over again, right? What other questions or concerns do you have? Maybe perhaps one more.
We had a concern that people would not understand the process, and when it was completed, be unhappy with the result.
Okay, so that's where we have taken ownership of designing the process and the levels of community engagement to try to head some of that off to try to bring as many people to the table as possible. Maybe one more. We've addressed them all. Okay, how'd we do? Has everybody mixed their groups up a bit?
Oh, really?
So we've only got a couple of more things to do tonight. The sort of second half of the evening is about looking at some examples of where some of these educational principles have influenced the design. And so while it's impossible to try to give you a full picture of what the possibilities are, we've selected 5 examples tonight, some of which are our work, some of which are other architects in Massachusetts, and actually there's one example from the Pacific Northwest, to illustrate how these educational principles, in fact, can influence how a building is shaped. And so unlike the earlier part of the evening, we only have one more exercise. And so I want to encourage you to ask questions on the fly if there are things you'd like to know more about than what I'm sharing with you as part of the formal presentation. So interrupt me if there are questions. I want to start by saying that there's some new research out that has illustrated that the design of a building matters. Right, we hear an awful lot that, well, you know, in ancient Greece they used to teach under a tree. I can learn anywhere, no problem. What do we need a new building for, right? Somebody asked that just a few minutes ago. Well, this research by Dr. Barrett and others was just published in 2015, and what he attempted to do was to look at physical features of buildings and factor out all of the other influences on student learning. And his conclusion was that the progress made by students over a span of time, 16% of that progress is directly attributable to facility characteristics. All right, so if a student progresses, 3 learning units, whatever those are, 16% of those 3 learning units are directly attributable to the building itself. To put that in context, that's about the same percentage as the effectiveness of the teacher. That's not to say that right? That's not to say that that teachers don't matter, right? All that means is that this is not an insignificant percentage, right? We absolutely need teachers, right? Don't misconstrue that data, right? And there's lots of factors that influence student learning, right? Socioeconomic status, educational attainment of the parents, right? The geographic location, right? But what he attempted to do is factor all of those other things out, and this is the number that he came up with. Right, there have been other studies, right? A famous one is the Hashung-Mahoney group, determined that daylighting alone can influence student test scores by as much as 20%, windowed versus windowless spaces, right? And so the facility matters. And so rather than sort of go through all of the hundreds of characteristics that a facility can have, these are 6 characteristics that we like to pay careful attention to and that I want you to think about as we're looking at these 5 examples. We've talked a lot about flexibility. Flexibility, in my mind, refers to the ability to change your mind over time, in the minute, over the course of a week or a semester, over the course of years, as educational philosophies change, that the building can adapt and accommodate multiple ways of teaching and learning without the need to uproot walls, right? Build a new building, those sort of major changes. Variety refers to the one-size-fits-all that we've been talking about, right? How many different kinds of spaces are present in these designs? Are there big spaces? Are there little spaces? Are there noisy spaces, messy spaces, clean spaces, quiet, all of that sort of stuff? Is learning on display? Visibility, right? This can take lots of different forms, right? Historically, this has only taken in the form of, right, student performances. The orchestra plays a performance, or a play is given, right? But we're seeing more and more facilities where visibility actually refers to being able to see learning happen live. Interior glass. Curation of student work, right? If there's a project, a culminating project, that it's actually posted on the wall, right, for everyone to see in sort of a museum experience, not just, pinned to a tack board for a couple of weeks. Stimulation refers to architectural stimulation, right? Part of Barrett's research suggested that if a space is overly stimulating, lots of bright colors, lots of architectural fanciness going on that can actually be detrimental. But the other end of the spectrum is also detrimental, that if it's too bland, right, that can impair student performance. So from an architectural stimulation point of view, ideally we'd want to be somewhere in the middle, where there is some visual interest, but not too much. UTech refers to ubiquitous technology. That technology is in the hands of everyone, not just in the hands of teachers or specialists. And then finally, daylight. How you position instructional spaces relative to the sun can be really important. Instructional spaces that face east or west, for example, have really low angle light in the wintertime and can produce a lot of glare. So ideally, we like to orient instructional spaces facing north or south. And then controlled in a manner that it's high quality daylight, not just very intense daylight. So think about those 6 characteristics as we look through these examples. And then in addition to those, right, these are some of the topics that we talked about earlier. Think about how the building is organized. Is it organized by team? Is it organized by some thematic topic? Is it organized by department, by grade level? How is the building zoned? We talked about safety and security a few minutes ago as being an important issue. Is it zoned into public and private? Is it zoned into academic and non-academic? Is it zoned into middle school, high school? We already talked about variety and flexibility. We talked about daylight, and then we talked about stimulation. So Robin Dunbar was a social anthropologist, and he came up with the theory of 150. Is anybody familiar with this idea? This comes from the business world. His research suggested that no one can have a meaningful relationship with more than 150 people. Right, so those of you that have 1,200 Facebook friends, you're probably not in a meaningful relationship with all of them. And so that research has been translated into the idea that we should organize buildings into intentional groupings of around 150 kids. How we do that is up for discussion. But this is an illustration of that principle. And in your example, perhaps it means that high school is organized into some groups of 150 on one side, and middle school potentially is organized into some groups of 150 on the other side. Inside each one of those clusters, a common design principle that's emerging is that not all of the instructional spaces are the same size. And so what these boxes are representing is that perhaps not all classrooms have exactly the same features. We'll show you an example of a built project that has that right now. This illustration also suggests that perhaps instruction doesn't only happen in the classroom, but there are other kinds of spaces that are in this grouping of 150. Perhaps there's some small group rooms, an open-sided small group area, or perhaps even a group for more than one class to get together is in like a breakout common space. The yellow arrows are meant to indicate that idea of interior views. Right? Could you be in this space as a teacher with a group of kids and still be able to observe an adjacent classroom because there's windows to that space? And then the blue arrows are meant to indicate views to the outside. Again, part of this Barrett research was that daylighting and views are really important to student performance. And so this suggests that we got to try to pay attention to those. Similarly, when we look inside an instructional space, this idea of flexibility is often expressed as zoning inside a classroom. So perhaps it's not all, tablet armchairs as in my classroom aimed at the chalkboard, but perhaps there's a zone for direct instruction or seminar, a zone for a different kind of seating, a think tank space perhaps. And perhaps there's another space for making of things or a messy space. This is an illustration by Fielding International. They're an architecture group out of Minnesota that expresses that concept of zones inside a learning space. In this case, it's sort of a Z-shaped instructional space. And you can see here's sort of a formal instructional space, small group, soft seating, a place for the teacher. And in this case, there's also access to wet and access to outside. All as part of that one classroom learning experience. Furniture is becoming more and more important. Right, we talked about student choice, and perhaps not everything needs to be the same kind of furniture. And when we pick furniture, we should think about how long are students sitting in them, right? I had a conversation with somebody that was talking about coming to an athletic banquet and sitting in one of those, attached seats for 4 hours. That didn't align seat time with the piece of furniture that was selected. Durability, right? Greg Haddon spoke about this before. We don't want to continually repair or replace furniture, so we have to think about this being in a school environment. Can kids move it? Can teachers move it by themselves? Right? Again, this gets to the idea of flexibility. Is it comfortable? Is it ergonomically designed? Right? We often see school districts choosing some desks that are stand-up desks, right? Because there's some evidence to suggest that that's more ergonomic and healthier than being in a seated position. What do we do with them when we don't want them? Right, a lot of furniture manufacturers right now are designing tables that are flip-top. What that means is that the legs are fixed and you grab a hold of it on the side and the tabletop actually folds up vertically so that they can nest together and go against the wall. And now in your classroom you have a lot of open floor area because you can store them easily. And then again, can they be operated without the aid of a custodian? So our first example is by Gcj Architects. This is in Bridgeport, Connecticut. It's a project that just won in 2016 an International Design and Planning Award for being an innovative learning environment. There is a video for this, but I'm going to skip over it because of that. And so this is the what they call the first floor, and let me just orient you. There are 2 front doors. This is a high school. Technically, it's 3 high schools all under one roof, but it's a high school organized into these 3 majors. We picked it because it has a similar alignment to this idea of innovation schools that Pentucket has. And in their case, they chose to organize the building around those 3 areas of study. And so there's one front door here. This is the main office. There's a second front door here where buses discharge. And this space all along in here is a student commons. It serves as the connective tissue on this level between everything that's happening in the building. You have a black box theater. You have gym and athletics in that space. Those are toilets. And then these are stairs. This is actually all nature underneath the building on this level. So this is all daylit glass facing north on this level that experiences this park-like environment to the outside. This is what that space looks like. So here's that park-like environment out here. And the real advantage of a design idea like this is that yes, it's useful for cafeteria, but because of where it is and how it's shaped, it can double as the lobby for performances, or as a lobby for an athletic event, or as an art gallery when they're having their art show. It has multiple functions other than just being a cafeteria. This is the second floor plan, and here you start to see the classrooms articulated. And what I'll draw your attention to here is that here's that student dining commons. These white areas represent open to below. So you can walk along this corridor and experience that dining commons by looking over a balcony into that condition. So it serves as connective tissue even on the floor above. In each one of these wings, I have an illustration, a better illustration of this in just a second. Not all of the instructional spaces are the same. And so even though each one of these wings is serving a different program of study, the shape of the spaces across are the same. And the design idea there was they wanted to be able to change their mind. Perhaps next year they're not going to offer information technology and software. They're going to offer something else as a program of study. So the spaces in that wing needed to be flexible enough to change their mind over time. At both ends of each one of these is a student collaboration space. In fact, they're individual student workstations. You can just make it out here. So the idea is that teachers will allow their students to matriculate down to this end or down to the other end just off this image when the activity is appropriate for that use of that space. So this is one level of one program of study, and you can see that there's a breakout space here, that not all of the spaces are the same size. This is teacher planning. In this building, teachers do not own classrooms. right? They often occupy the same classroom day to day, but their teacher materials, their personal desk is actually in this teacher suite. We'll have some other examples of that in just a minute. Here's that student collaboration space. So if students are doing individual research and they would prefer to be out here rather than be in the classroom, they can choose to do so. You can see that there's a teacher with a group of kids around the, the smartboard at the end doing a different kind of activity. On the upper floors, there are some sustainable design features where the building itself is part of the curriculum. So each one of the programs of study has a green roof. And they're raising plants. They actually keep a bee colony in one of them. And this is what that looks like. There's the bee colonies back there on the edge. So they're taking advantage of the orientation of those roofs and the fact that they line up with the adjacent floor as an outdoor learning experience. And the kids maintain that all themselves. This building also has a whole set of microturbines as part of the learning experience. So students are actively monitoring how much energy is being generated by these turbines and where that energy is being expended in the building. The next example is one of ours, North Reading. It's a middle high school. It's in, obviously in North Reading. Here's a plan of the first floor, and just to orient you, this portion represents the middle school. Here's essentially the front door to the middle school. This portion represents the high school, and this is the front door to the high school. Administration is in the joint between those two entries. This little rectangle out here happens to be district offices. So in this case, their concept of middle high school was for core academic instruction, you're in your zone, right? Middle school classrooms are over here, high school classrooms are over here, but for art, music, PE, the cafeteria, the library, all of those things are in the shared zone. So there is some level of crossover. This feature right here is what we call Main Street. We have a shot of this being used as a craft fair in just a minute. But it's much like that dining commons in Fairchild Wheeler, except in this case it's not the cafeteria. It's simply a widened corridor, recognizing that there's a lot of students in this building. All of them are traveling through this shared space at the same time, and because of its size and shape, again, it can double as the lobby for the PE complex, the cafeteria, and the auditorium. We know that some of you are interested in the fine and performing arts and athletics, so I wanted to zoom in for a minute on the shared section. This is a standard MSBA gymnasium. You see a competition court there with bleachers on one side. This gym can also be sectioned off to have two full-size cross courts operating at the same time. In addition to that space, there are two what we might call auxiliary PE spaces, one dedicated to weights and fitness, and one that's more flexible for things like dance. These are locker rooms, a series of team and PE lockers. These are two health classrooms. So there's quite a lot of space there associated with instruction in the health and physical education department. This is a performing arts space with music spaces, instructional music spaces behind it. And the way this works is you enter at the highest level of the house, back here at Main Street, and then you proceed down into the house to the level of the stage at a level below. So all of the music spaces are at that lowest level associated with the stage. This is sort of back of house custodial maintenance. This is what that Main Street looks like when it's being used as a craft fair. So in that floor plan illustration, it looks like a really big space, but once you get people in there, you can see really how quickly that space gets filled up. This is a shot of that gym. And the thing, obviously, we're trying to point out here is that the gym is not this enclosed box, right? It's an example of putting learning on display. So students who are passing by in that Main Street corridor can witness whatever's happening even in the gym. Here's that dance space, and the thing that I'll highlight here is the quality of natural daylight. Here's a shot of the Performing Arts Theater. In this particular case, the district chose not to do something really fancy like an orchestra pit, but the front of this stage is removable. So again, it's trying to address that note of flexibility. Some of you have been to visit Winthrop Middle High School. This is by HMFH Architects out of Cambridge. It's an incredibly compact design. And they do try to maintain a high level of separation between the middle school and the high school, and they do it with 2 sets of doors. Just to orient you, here's one set of doors. These are high school instructional spaces. The other set of doors is right here, and the library serves as the boundary. These are middle school spaces, right, an auditorium, and then things like the cafeteria are actually on level 1. One of the things I want to point out about this is that they've used the gym as the organizing feature. So this illustration is essentially a vertical slice right down through the middle of the building. So it's a 3-story building, and the gym occupies all 3 stories. So you, just like North Reading, you can peer into that gym as you walk around it on all 4 sides. Unfortunately, this plan, although it resulted in a really compact footprint, resulted in some instructional spaces that are not daylit. The only daylight that's provided is via skylights coming into the gym, and then you can just make them out through what we call borrowed lights, views into the gym from that space. So it was a compromise they made to get the full program on that particular site. They also have some maker spaces in this project. They use it for a boat building program. And this again is an example of being willing to take advantage of the outside as part of the learning experience. They also have a number of breakout spaces. Much like we saw in the Fairchild-Wheeler example, these bistro height tables and these loose tables are just outside of classrooms, which are on the behind the camera in this particular shot. So students can spill out into those spaces and occupy them as they need, as an alternative learning environment to the classroom. Meadowdale is a middle school in Linwood, Washington. I am going to try to play this one. Hopefully we'll have some luck, because it's parents and students talking about the benefit that they received from a brand new building. We'll give it a try.
The Inman School District has had a long-term building program, and we have a pretty well-articulated planning process. And for the Meadowdale project, we took the opportunity to really do something different and make this a model for middle school educational programs.
I absolutely love the collaborative process where we were going back and forth and deciding how we were going to build this. And the big part was it's a 21st century school, and teaching 21st century, it went together.
This was going to be the first middle school we'd ever done. And one of the first things we did was bring in a visioning consultant for the initial phase, but there was a moment when everything changed.
When John Wiles joined the group, there was sort of this aha moment amongst the existing Meadowdale staff about what it really means to be a learner in the age of emerging adolescence. Part of the result of that was a series of personalized learning communities.
The word personalized learning became essential to design. Developmentally, we have to be honoring each child as an individual and also teach the whole child. They need opportunities to explore their interests, and they need indoor and outdoor space and lots of flexible space.
The core planning principle was creating these 5 personal learning communities loosely connected that consisted of classrooms and flexible labs grouped around a central shared area.
You have like these spaces that you can come out to for group projects and to do your homework.
Collaborative learning is happening throughout the school. And for the kids, this is a more natural social environment. They're connecting learning with positive social behavior, and I think this is
So close. So what they were going to go on to say was that some of the academic and disciplinary challenges that they had in the old building evaporated as a result of the new building. And the example they cited the most was with this space right here. This is their cafeteria, but notice that there's not walls on all 4 sides. There's actually a seat stair here that spills into the hallway above, and students are actually allowed to go outside during lunch. And what they said was the minute you gave them an opportunity to move, the disciplinary problems improved. Right? If you think about that set of tables and chairs over there, what that communicates to a kid is, this is where you have to be. And anybody that knows about this age group, keeping them confined is not something they're interested in. Right? And so this project embraced a lot of those personalization and student choice concepts, and it resulted in an arrangement of spaces that don't look like a conventional, double-loaded corridor. So here's the floor plan that he was talking about, one of those personalized learning communities. It's got 4 what we might call classrooms, not the same shape and not outfitted the same. Only this one has a sink. These have an alcove where soft furnishings are, and then there's a high level of glass between these classrooms and what they call the shared cyber bar space. There's also an enclosed small group room there that they use for special education when that's appropriate for those kids that need that support. It's adjacent to a science lab so that this can be an interdisciplinary experience. Incidentally, the other science lab is right next door for efficiency of infrastructure, and there's another personal learning community just off the page here. There's also direct access to the outside so that the learning can spill again into the out of doors. I think this is our last example. This is one of our work that's just opened in the fall of 2017. We're going to go visit this project tomorrow. The existing high school was in place before construction began, and with the exception of these 3 rooms that were the former high school auditorium and band room, all of the middle school is new construction. The choice was to place it attached to the existing high school for the synergies that existed between the 2 experiences. Students who were ready for it could take advantage of high school programming. High school kids could take advantage of peer mentoring opportunities at the middle school. And in addition to that, the middle school offers some spaces that the high school doesn't have that the high school can now use before and after school. Unlike North Reading, this is 2 legitimately separate schools under one roof. The high school front door is over here. The middle school front door is over here. High school administration is here. Middle school administration is here. These are high school gyms, high school cafeteria, high school kitchen, middle school dining commons, middle school kitchen, middle school gym. So they have their own separate space across the board. Part of the way they were able to accomplish this is because the high school was existing, and by and large we weren't touching the high school. If this had all been built from scratch, as potentially your project will be, the MSBA would likely be looking for efficiencies and not duplicating many of those large volume spaces. But because it was existing, we were able to get these things as part of the project. In addition to the middle school, we also built the high school a new performing arts center. So the middle school is 2 floors, organized into interdisciplinary teams, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In this particular case, they said, hey, 6th grade is a different animal. So can you create a little bit of separation for them? So 6th grade lives on the 1st and 2nd floor of this eastern arm. If we were to look at each one of those, there's a couple of features we want to draw your attention to. First of all, in each team, there are 8 spaces: special education, a smaller learning studio, science space, art space, 2 larger learning studios, and a medium-sized learning studio. And a grade level owns all 8 spaces together. Again, no one owns their own room in this project. Teachers' home base are in this teacher planning suite. And even though the concept is still evolving, they are picking and choosing the space that matches the activity rather than trying to force every activity into a predefined space. So they have those Those learning studios, they also have 2 small group rooms, a big one and a small one. They have a media commons to spill out. They have this little, what we call a drop-in presentation space. One of the themes of this project was public speaking. As a project-based learning school, they recognized that students needed opportunities to practice public speaking. So you'll see these kinds of presentation opportunities at a lot of different scales. You saw the Performing Arts Center also built into the project. You'll also notice that there's a fair amount of glass between each learning studio and this media commons. This is how we imagined it being used during the design and planning process, and this is how it's actually being used today. So this is one of those large learning studios that you're seeing. This is actually a 10-foot wide sliding glass pocket door. Because we recognized that vertical surface was going to be at a premium in this project, we were able to recess that door in the wall cavity, and it can be a 3-foot opening or a 10-foot opening, depending on what's appropriate. The furniture is at a lot of different heights to give students a wide variety of choice. And it's all mobile. This is that teacher planning space, and just like students teachers need access to daylight. They need a place they can call their own. This also has a refrigerator, microwave, a small group room next door for private phone calls. We've positioned the digital display in a place that no matter where a student stands out in the corridor, they can't see that. So they can project student data on the wall and talk about whether teaching strategies are working or not without worrying about students seeing that. This is another one of those presentation spaces. We call this the exhibition space. This is meant to give students an opportunity to present their work in an environment that honors it in a way that a classroom never could. Right? So this isn't, pinning up in the corridor. This isn't presenting your work in a giant auditorium or in a cafeteria. It's in a venue that's appropriate for about 25 people, but it has technology, it has lighting, it has an opportunity to display, curate student work like I talked about a little bit before. And then this is the dining commons. I think this is the last shot for this project. This was a client that wanted to use their words, deinstitutionalize the student dining experience. And so rather than a one-size-fits-all, everybody go into the same room experience, we designed multiple experiences, one of which you can't see in this illustration. So the first one is a fairly typical, large volume arrangement, but all of the furniture is mobile. There's no attached seats to tables. And again, variety of heights. The second environment is back here. It's a lower ceiling. There are actually banquettes and booths back there. It's a different acoustical experience, even though you can still see and be part of this larger experience. The third experience is up here on the balcony. We call this the balcony cafe. It's more like a Starbucks experience. It only seats about 25 people. Again, it's acoustically a little different, but it has a view into the larger dining space. And then this is actually a satellite kitchen. The original design intent was that this would not only be home for things that were going to serve their home economics program, but that snacks would be served out of this space to students all day long, recognizing that food is an important part of the learning process. And then the fourth one is this seat stair itself. This is an oversized stair where each riser can serve as a seat. And students are allowed to choose among these environments where they want to have lunch. And this is what a shot of it looks like in action. So because we took advantage of things like this seat stair, again, it's that space issue. Kids aren't on top of each other. They're able to move around. Because they're able to choose, they're finding that, again, that disciplinary problems are different than what they had in their old building. An interesting side note about this, the superintendent was adamant that we make decisions about the dining commons with kids in mind, not with custodians in mind. And so you can imagine this environment for custodians. And Greg? Yep. So shortly after opening day, custodians complained about how difficult this was to clean. And so rather than, sort of give in to that request and say students can't eat, in certain places or have this kind of furniture, the principal said, well, what would you need to clean it? And sort of as a joke, one of the custodians said, well, man, we'd have to have a leaf blower to clean this thing. So they bought them 6 leaf blowers. And after lunch, they blow debris down the stairs onto the floor and they clean it up. And they essentially developed a technique to clean it and still retained the idea that students are the most important. So because we can't share every possible scenario with you, when we make this presentation available on the district's website, there are some other places you can go visit to see more examples of facilities that embody these 21st century learning principles. Yes?
For perspective, at least the 2 projects that you did, can you tell us like the size of the student body
Yeah.
in comparison to ours?
So I'm the most familiar with the Gates Middle School project. That was designed for 735 6th through 8th grade, and there was another 850 9th through 12th graders. So all in, there was more than 1,000 kids in Situate. And North Reading was all in 1,450, again, grades 6 through 12. And what are you? Your design enrollment is 965 for grades 7 through 12. Good question. Any other questions? Okay, so this is our last formal activity for the evening, and this is actually going to be an individual activity. Certainly we want you to talk among each other as you do this, but we're asking for individual responses. What we'd like you to do is take the Post-its on your note, the Post-its on your table, and the pens, and respond to these 3 prompts. We have 2 sets of boards that have the same imagery that we just showed you. So half of the room will go to one set of boards, half of the room will go to the other set of boards. And as you look at them, respond to these things. I like, I wish, I wonder. And here's some examples. I really like the idea of a multi-purpose, student dining commons. I wish I knew more about something. Or, I wonder if we can take advantage of X, Y, and Z. Okay? So please only write 1 response on each Post-it note. We have more if we run out. There's no limit to how many responses you can write. You can comment on everything. You can only comment on one thing. What's important for us is to be able to interpret what you're writing about when we get back to the office. Okay? So please place your responses on the thing that they refer to, or be explicit about what you're referring to in your response itself. Questions about that?
He wants to look at all the designs and then come up with I like, I wish, I wonder.
Yep, and hopefully you don't do just 3. Right, you can have multiple I likes and no I wishes. Or you can have multiple of each. Right, what we're looking for is we're looking for your reaction to the design features that we've just talked about. Okay? We're not doing don't likes. If you want to raise a question about something, form it as an I wonder. I wonder why they did this, or I wonder why they didn't do that. Other questions about what we're asking you to do? We want to give you a little bit of time to do this because there's a lot of things to digest here, and we want you to have enough time to look over all of the examples. Our crew will be floating around. If you have questions, grab us and we'll try to respond to them. Let's hear about what you wrote. And I want to take a little time to do this because this is the translation of the educational piece into space, right? Who wants to tell us about their responses? Anybody?
I loved the idea of the middle school and the high school being separate, but the shared space of North Reading, was it? North Reading. Yeah, I thought that was really impressive.
And if I can just follow up, what you mean is you like that model where the boundary is a little fuzzier than the Situate model where it was highly separate. Okay? What else? Alyssa?
I like the natural light. I like the outdoor space. I have sort of practical questions about some of it. The green roof, what if it really snows a lot? And the Cambridge roof had all these interesting designs, but does that add cost, and how do you maintain that over time?
Man in the blue sweater right there, right in front of you can answer that. Rick, I'm talking about you. Well, I'm not an expert on green roofs, so I mean, I'm familiar with them, and you know, you have a membrane that would prevent, I guess you're concerned. The weight of the green roof?
If it has a really heavy snow.
Well, just like any other roof, you design it to accommodate the load. I mean, so when you design a roof here, you design it to accept the increased load of the snow load. Right? Of course, maybe this isn't a great structure to use it as an example because we've had problems before. But in general terms, you know, you design to accommodate the snow load that it may be impossible to anticipate the worst year, the highest snowfall we've ever had. That's hard to anticipate and hard to predict. But in general terms, you just design to accommodate the load.
I think that's exactly right. In fact, with green roofs, as they are in the Bridgeport project, there's already additional weight because of the planter boxes that has to be supported, so the structure is even already beefier to support that stuff. But yes, you would design it to the load. What other questions do you have? Or, no, I'm sorry, what other responses do you want to share? Yeah, Mike?
I like the use of the rooms being separate sizes for different functions, public speaking areas, especially the furniture being different because everybody learns differently. So I found that interesting.
I noticed, what about athletics? Because a few people have asked us that also. I understand the footprint of the building is very important for learning and so forth and so on. But athletics, as in music and all the other stuff that's quite not as in the norm of learning, I would guess people would say. Where is that designed in? And
So we didn't have a lot of examples tonight of outdoor athletic space. We were trying to use the North Reading example of what might be typical for a project of your size in terms of the interior health and PE athletic spaces. One of the things we'll talk about in visioning session number 2 is those site amenities, what play fields, what practice fields want to be part of the project. And so we didn't really have that in the examples tonight, but it certainly will be part of the project, and we'll talk about them in more detail at visioning session number 2. Did that answer your question, or? Yep, absolutely are. Yes.
I'm wondering about the presence and importance of library media centers.
It's a really good question. And it varies by district. What I can tell you about the Situate project that we're going to go see tomorrow is that there is no library. There's no space for the library. There is a full-time library media specialist. There is a reading collection. It's just not in a single space. So in that particular project, they made the decision that they would rather put that square footage and those printed resources at arm's reach to kids instead of centralizing them as a destination. In the North Reading project, there is a centralized, quite nice library media center that serves both the middle school and the high school. So I wouldn't say that there's a specific trend in either direction, but we're seeing districts explore multiple ways of thinking about the library. We have an elementary school that's in the planning phases right now that is a hybrid of those two ideas. There's a small centralized location, and then there are satellite locations in addition to that. So there's a wide variety of things that we can explore, but we're not seeing books go away anytime soon. But how we think about space may be something worth discussing. Yes.
Are there state requirements about special education spaces that need to be carefully considered, or?
So special education from the point of view of MSBA is something to which they'll defer to the district. There are guidelines for that as sort of a department in some of the tools that they have. And we have to make special submissions to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education around special education. But ultimately, both of those bodies just want to be assured that the space that's being created aligns with what you're trying to do from a special education point of view. What we won't be allowed to do is consolidate all of the special education spaces in one area of the building and sort of push them off to the side, right? That's bad practices, and they actually won't let us do that. But outside of that, they will typically defer to the district as long as the evidence is there that we're supporting what we're trying to do from a design point of view.
Two things. One, the art rooms, I didn't really get a great view of what they would look like, and it looked like one space as opposed to dark rooms, ceramic studio.
I can elaborate. I'm going to speak about ours because I know our examples, I know more about them. In North Reading, the art spaces are dedicated and they're in the shared zone, and they're offering a wide variety of media. In the Situate example, art is distributed because it's part of the interdisciplinary concept, and it's meant to be a space that could be used by other teachers if they needed access to water or to specialized materials. They do, in Situate, they also do have access to an arts plaza that's immediately outside those arts spaces. Brad, did you want to add something about? And so at visioning session number 3, what we're going to give you the opportunity to do is create a list of things we want to develop concepts for. Perhaps one of them is art, and then we'll talk, in much finer detail about where they are relative to other things, how many different varieties of art are there, and we'll have that in visioning session number 3.
And then the second thing that I saw was the cafeterias. I just wanted to comment. I like the model where you have an open space for some students, but not all students love the cafeteria experience. And if we could consider having some more private spaces for the students that don't want to be like in the spotlight in the middle of the lobby.
Yeah, we don't have one that's open yet, but at many of the elementary schools, we're designing now, there's sort of this idea of dining experience isn't the same for everybody, but at these elementary schools, they've taken the extra step of creating what we might call quiet cafes, where imagine that had a glass wall at the commons, and that was an enclosed room that was acoustically separate from this one so that it was one visual dining experience, but for those students with sensory issues or who just want a more quiet environment for lunch, have that choice. And so that's, again, part of the discussion that we can have about what is the dining experience and how many different types of spaces do we need to serve that particular function.
I guess these sessions are about what we want and what we like and what we'd like to see. Is there a certain formula with MSBA that when we see an auditorium or a gym, are they limited because of their formula that we have 965 children that we're going to be educating that model, and so are we going to get ahead of ourselves with a wish list that we might not even be able to have?
my response to that is, how big is your pocketbook? So, so the short answer to your question is yes. There are guidelines and basic limits on things like the size of the house for an auditorium, right? And that guideline is 2/3 of the design enrollment times 15 square feet per person, with a cap of 750 kids. So for you, that would be in the 620 seats range in the house. We did a count the other day. We don't think you have near that many currently. But as of about a year and a half ago, the MSBA has changed their policy on this to allow districts to build larger auditoriums or larger gyms than their out-of-the-box guidelines would suggest. But there's additional expense associated with that that would be borne by the town and not eligible for reimbursement.
There are some specific exclusions, right? Kind of no-fly zone. Like, for example, Wayne and I were just talking about field houses.
Correct. And swimming pools, yes.
And some of those types of things. So while as deep as your pocketbook goes, we don't want to fill that type of clock up in the community, right? But Jason's right, but there are specific exclusions which, you know, if you go down that path, we're going to have an issue, okay, with MSB. A couple of those exclusions that I just spoke about. But there are also, you know, ways to get pretty darn close to some of that stuff if that's where everybody wants to go. But, you know, we won't call them that or what have you. But, you know, ultimately this is a partnership with MSB. They're funding a significant portion of this. And we're in that partnership collaboration business like we've been talking about tonight.
Yeah.
And so it's important that we keep that in mind while still trying to go and, you know, get all of the things that we feel that we need. And, you know, maybe there's also some nuance out there that we're fortunate not to get as well.
Yeah. And the MSBA, I'll give them credit, they want to support the educational mission of districts. And so if there's a programmatic reason, a curricular reason to have a certain kind of space or a certain size of space, the MSBA will at least entertain that discussion, right? Any other responses folks would like to share? Everybody's anxious to get home. So we'd like to end the evening with a sort of an informal exercise and an invitation. So the students who have been filming tonight would like volunteers who are willing to be, filmed making a statement about how you felt about tonight's activities. So after we conclude, the guys will be around asking people to volunteer to do that if you're interested. In addition to that, here's a large group. We'd like to do sort of the same thing. What are you taking as key takeaways away from tonight's session? It can be in the form of, I really liked this, or I really liked that. I had one person offer up some criticism of me. That's okay too. Her criticism was I didn't tell her my daughter's name. But if you have other criticism, we're willing to hear that too. We always want to grow. So, Dick, you had something?
Having already experienced this at North Reading, I see this as a wonderful opportunity for Pentucket to get 2 state-of-the-art schools for the price of 1. We've been offered 52%, and I see this more as a package. If we just do one instead of the other, whoever is the other, that could be 10, 15 years away, and we're already putting money into both buildings that are well over 50. Now, I have coffee with some friends. One of them is 85 years old, and he's already figured out in Groveland that after 50 years, you need a new school. He's already on board. So if we can kind of pass the word on and get our neighbors in here for session 2, we might. But I'm really in full support of 2 schools for the price of 1. Best deal in town.
Okay, I will echo Dick's sentiment that please invite others, make them feel welcome to come to visioning session number 2. Other key takeaways from this evening. Oh, come on. Yep, Steve.
Yeah, I'll just say I'm impressed with the flexibility of spaces that we've seen. You know, the examples you had, the educational space concepts go so far beyond what I was ever exposed to. You know, the use of daylighting, the use of interior windows, the sort of the flexibility of spaces in general. You know, I'm just trying to kind of absorb it all and figure out how to add something creative in the thought process.
Everybody's tired? Yeah, Glenn?
Well, I'd like to thank I'm not sure if this is just a regular process because this is the first time that we've done this, but I'm happy that these visioning sessions are so open, and you're open for community input, and I think it means something when we're saying something and we're putting sticky notes on plans and so forth. So I think that means a lot, and I thank you for that.
Was there any aha moments for anybody this afternoon? Hey, I'd never heard of that before, or I never connected those two things before. Just batting 0 tonight. It's okay.
Next one's shorter.
So, if there, oh, yes. Oh, thank you, sir.
An aha moment I had that is like so obvious, but it didn't really occur to me until I was reading another poster that in all of this, we're looking at all these pretty things that we want in our school, but safety has to be like a paramount thing. And we're talking about being able to see through glass and all of that stuff, and that's such a wonderful concept. And I think it's great, but every day we're reminded on the news of all these scary things that are happening. So we want an amazingly beautiful, really, really safe school. So partnering those two things. And I think that I was not really even thinking about that part. So it's an important part.
One last, yes.
I'll make it short and sweet. But as a student coming to this meeting, I realized that this project is a lot more than just making a new building. It does have an impact on the students and even community members. And I found that being able to have everybody's input to see how the new ideas could be adapted by students and teachers, it will be more beneficial to the students to come later on. So thank you.
It's always great to be determined. Yeah, Dennis.
This is about the, I guess, the outreach. So in a regional district where we have multiple towns, it'd just be interesting to know the timetable that we're working with and how we get that information out
there. The question was about the timetable. Can you be a little more specific? Are you asking about turnaround time for processing what you see here?
Well, so we've got 60 people here who are supportive in general, but people who aren't in this room, what do they need to know? When do they need to know it? What's the action plan to get out to those folks? What's our role? What's other people's role?
He's asking about sort of the communication action plan. How do we disseminate and reach out to folks who aren't in the room this evening?
Right, so that's a good question. That's something we've talked about with the building committee because they're obviously very concerned about that. We understand that with the 3 towns, past history of previous project vote, that they're reaching out and expanding the circle is important. And so this is really the first step. We have laid out a process of public meetings. We're also going to rotate those public meetings through all 3 towns, so everything just doesn't happen in one town, to kind of further engage them and maybe get you to visit your neighboring towns as well. And it's basically a year-long process. We kind of skipped over that quickly. Jason did talk about it at the beginning, but the study process where we develop the many is what we're doing right now. We'll get to the few midwinter, and by March we'll be down to 1 recommended option to prefer, and that's just what we call a bubble diagram. It's the right size. We filled out that Msba spreadsheet, but we really haven't thought about interior details other than adjacencies. And then we have a whole nother phase that takes us through till September where we do schematic design. We start to think about what it looks like, what's glass, what we've done about security, how the different spaces work out. So it's really a full year process, and we do want to expand with each step and engage people on many levels. And you all are the first step. And I want to also just say my takeaway is this is a great turnout. It may not feel like it, but we have some of these, and there's not that many people. So this is a great turnout. And like we said before, to reach out to your friends and neighbors, encourage them to come to the next visioning meeting. We'll make it even better.
The last part is the votes, the town votes are currently targeted for the fall of 18?
Correct. The votes that authorize funding will be tentatively scheduled for the fall of 18.
Just so also everybody knows, we have started the process with the town, going out and talking to the leadership of what is left in individual towns, just to make them aware of what's going on as well. So we've met with Groveland, and I think that went pretty decent. We're planning on meeting with Merrimack on Monday at Merrimack. And so, those of you from Merrimack, this is a good opportunity, because we didn't have a lot of Merrimack here tonight. We'd like to see more, to attend that meeting, and so that people can become informed. Sooner or later, the leadership of West Newbury will let us know when we get to go and speak with them. And you know what? 2 weeks from Monday, we're all here. But I'd just like to say that this process is all about building momentum, right? And so this is the first step. You get 2 more of these, but you got to tell your friends, right? There was something on the wall there that said, what happens if it fails? If it fails, we all lose. It's not Merrimack, it's not West Newbury, it's not Groveland. It's not us. Right? Thank you.
Is there a plan for some sort of long-term public relations campaign around the vote? Because it's going to be
Yes. Oh, jeez. I plan to yell loudly and no. One other thing that's going on right now I should mention is Dr. Mulqueen has engaged this surveying tool called Thought Exchange, and he's run one of those already. He's running another one in November, and that's a way to engage the community in getting them to talk about what they want in the school. There is a complete communications plan, and it's been really good working with Brad and his team, because I, like many of you, immediately wanted to go out with all guns blazing to get people whipped into a froth to get us this great new school. But you really got to take things in a measured way. Just because you don't want to leapfrog, so everyone's like, well, how much is it going to cost? It's like, well, no. I mean, you look at the stage we're in, that's way down the road. So while there is this feeling that there's a sense of urgency here, we got to get out the vote, there is a process I think we need to take. And we are going to use every available channel we have, whether it's PR, media coverage, whether it's, using our Facebook sites. A big thing is people in this room talking to other people, because we are small communities, and the food mart can be a very effective communications vehicle. So I hope that answers that a little bit.
So the next 2 visioning session dates are on the board. A week from tonight, on the 15th, we're going to talk about those key issues of design enrollment, building organization. We're going to do some overall building diagramming. And in response to some feedback we've received, those are going to be shorter and start later. So both of those sessions right now are scheduled from 6 to 9. We need to have some more discussion with the district about whether food is going to be available. If they have an answer to that, we'll get that out to you. But the start time will be at 6 o'clock rather than at 4 o'clock for both of those sessions. Please invite your friends and neighbors. And so with that, let me just thank you guys. I know that 4 hours is a long stretch for an evening like this. It's incredibly important work. I think the information and feedback that we received as your design team is going to be incredibly valuable even at these very early stages. And it'll only get more important as we get into more and more detail. So thank you for spending the evening with us. We hope to see everybody back a week from now on the 15th.
Thank you.